I find that whenever you are doing something, if you have a framework that acts as your guide, and that's typically useful in the overall process. So I always try to think about like how to create framework for anything that I'm using. So first framework that I will provide is sort of a framework that I have devised, which I call ACE, which has 3 components: analyze, craft, and evaluate. And this is a framework we will discuss in the context of the previous examples that we had. And then I will also discuss a second framework, which is CLEAR, which is short for concise, logical, explicit, adaptive, and reflective, which has been published in this paper. So this paper, The Clear Path, this is a paper which has been recently published. They also discuss about this framework, which could be used for the prompt engineering purposes. So let's move on to the first framework, which I in short call ACE, and there are 3 components to ACE. First component of this framework is analyze, and when we are talking about analyzing phase, what we want to do is, before we jump into and start using any interface like ChatGPT or large language model, it is important to analyze the problem, the set of questions that you are going to ask about it, right? I'm hoping that you're using it for useful purposes and there is a meaning for you to use that interface. So in that setting, it might be important for you to take some time and focus on the analyze issue before even if you start interacting with the interface, right? So analyze, I break it down to 3 main points, which is basically understanding your problem. So begin with a clear understanding of the task or the problem that you want to solve, or the type of answers that you want to get out of interfaces like ChatGPT. So understanding is like one of the subtopics under analyze category that you can follow when you're interacting with ChatGPT interface. Output, right? Consider what output do you need from the model in response to your problem. Think about like what could be a possible output, and that also helps you in analyzing. And as I said, analyzing also helps you in devising better prompts. And finally, scope. Determine the context and the scope of the task, right? And analyze this aspect, and that will also help you in posing better prompts to interfaces like ChatGPT. So let's move on to the second component of this framework, which is related to this word C. So this is for craft. So when we have analyzed the problem, the next step is to move into crafting the actual prompts, and we saw how good and bad prompts could be used to get different types of responses from ChatGPT. So in this step of the framework, I want you to focus on certain key aspects. First, using the principles that we talked about, the 5 principles we talked about, I want you to be very clear and ensure that the prompt that you're using is clear and specific, and does avoid like vague language, or does avoid very broad type of input to the ChatGPT interface. Now, when you're in the craft space, you're actually using the interface ChatGPT, right? So being clear in your prompts is going to help you, and then choosing a right format. So what is the right format, or choosing an appropriate input format for the specific task that you have analyzed in the previous step of framework is also going to be very, very useful, and choosing a right format is going to be crucial in getting better answers. In the next slide, after I have discussed the framework, in the next slide I will also try to talk about some of the standard formats that you can provide inputs to, and let's discuss that with respect to this craft in a little bit. But here one of the sub-step is providing right format to the ChatGPT to get better better responses out of it. And finally, also testing variation. Now interacting, you should not only be limited to testing out one or 2 prompts. Maybe you should test out variations of different prompts that might help you solve your problem better. And again, you can use the right format, or you can reframe the information that you want to get out of the ChatGPT in different formats, and that could lead to different variations, and you can test out different variations. Then that will help you in effectively getting better responses out of a ChatGPT model, right? So when we are talking about craft, right, I talked about this issue of choosing different types of output format. So I want to quickly go through simple examples. What are the different formats that could be existing in order for you to provide specific prompts to ChatGPT? So first, and I'm giving you just general 10 different formats. First format could be question format. Okay, so you can ask a prompt, or you can input a prompt which is in the question format. So for example, what is the capital of France is a question, and you can input your format or input your prompt in that format itself. Second prompt is command prompt. You can command the ChatGPT to do certain things where you're asking, for example, here the prompt is translate the following to French, and you're giving the word to translate. So this is a type of a command prompt format that you can provide your prompts to. Context setting prompts, right? So here what you do is you are setting up the context. So you're saying that you are a weather forecaster, and that's the context that you're giving the ChatGPT interface, and then asking for provide weather forecast for Greenville tomorrow. So in this setting, you're doing a prompting, what would be known as context setting prompts, or a format which will be known as context setting format. Here is another example where you're providing more description. So this is called a description format. So describe the process of photosynthesis. You're asking the ChatGPT itself to provide the answer in a description format itself. So this sort of prompt would fall into a category where you are basically doing what is known as descriptive prompting or descript format. Fifth one is comparison format, right? Compare the features of iPhone 13 and Samsung Galaxy S21, where you're using the ChatGPT interface to compare different things. So this input format where you're asking to compare two different objects, two different products, two different philosophies, two different ideas could be also a specific input format that you can talk about and you can provide when you're interacting with ChatGPT interface. Let's move on to the sixth one, which is the completion format, right? So you complete the following sentences where you're providing some input in the form of text which is incomplete, and you are asking the ChatGPT to complete the remaining sentence or follow on and add 3 or 4 more sentences. So this sort of input of prompting will be known as completion format prompting that is out there. Constraint format, which is the seventh one, where we are constraining the ChatGPT to give output in a very specific way. So we are asking, for example, write a 140 character tweet about movie Dune. Now we know that Twitter has restriction in terms of characters, so we want to get output in a specific format. So this is an input format, constraint format, where we are asking it to constrain and give the output in a constrained manner. So that could be also an input format for you to consider while providing prompts to the ChatGPT. Multi-step format, right? So you can write your prompts where there are multiple stages involved, multiple steps involved. So we will call this as a multi-step format for inputting prompts into ChatGPT. For example, first provide a summary of the topic and then list 3 advantages and disadvantages. And when we are doing this, we are asking it to get a summary of a problem in an article, and then from that article asking the ChatGPT to glean out what are the advantages and disadvantages. So this type of prompting or input of prompting will be known as multi-step format, where we are asking the answers in multiple different steps from the ChatGPT interface that we have. Conversation format. You can converse with ChatGPT and you can provide prompts that you are chatting with a traveler, continue the conversation from there. So now you have given a context and you're asking it to converse in a format that you are talking to certain users. So if you're using this sort of format, you will be using what is known as a conversation format of inputs to providing prompts to interfaces like ChatGPT. Finally, the final format, the input format that you can consider is interactive format, right? So here we are asking that you are probably a virtual assistant for a hotel and a guest is checking in and asking it to respond accordingly. So we are setting up a context, but the context setting is such that we are forcing the ChatGPT to behave like a virtual answering machine or virtual assistant and be more interactive, not only in terms of answering the question, maybe asking it to follow-up questions, because virtual assistants will also ask follow-up questions. So this sort of prompting where we are forcing the interface to be more interactive and providing the prompts in this sort of input format will be termed as interactive formats, right? So these are various formats of inputs that you can provide, and when you are in the second stage of the framework, which is basically the crafting space, right, the crafting phase, then you can use any of these 10 strategies to interact with, right? And again, consider also the principles that we discussed about it to formulate the prompt in a structured way so that you can get the most out of the interface that is there in the ChatGPT. So with that, let's move on to the third stage of this framework. Now you have interacted, you have provided the input, and you have got some responses. The next and the last stage of this is essentially evaluating the answers that you got out of the ChatGPT interface or the large language models that you have. So you have to assess the response. Does the response align with the objective that you have set out in the first stage, which is the analyze stage? Like did the answer meet the things that your objectives or the goals that you have set up in the first step of ACE framework, which is the analyze framework that we have, right? Factual accuracy, and this is the important part that I want to emphasize. If you are asking for a response which is a fact-based response, definitely you have to analyze and verify that. And this is one of the things that we will be considering in the last lecture, that most of the time we cannot ascertain the factual accuracy of the responses that we get out of ChatGPT. And so if your prompt or if your query is focused on getting some factual accuracy out of this kind of system, then you definitely need to check and verify. And the way and process to verify that response will be not only getting that response, maybe searching, doing your own independent search or Google search, or maybe going on to different scholastic websites and finding out whether the responses that was given, the factual responses that were given by ChatGPT is good or not. Many times, ChatGPT goes through a process known as hallucination, and it might give you answers which are bogus, right? So if you are asking for factual accuracy, then this framework becomes very important, and the evaluate step becomes very, very important. And I encourage you to, do a factual accuracy check of any response that you get out of this type of interfaces, like such as ChatGPT. Finally, iterate and refine, right? So you have evaluated the response, right? And then based upon the responses, it might be a good idea. You might not get the specific thing that you're looking for in a single shot. So then the idea is like, can we iterate and refine, right? So and how you do iterate and refine, maybe you can try different variations, different techniques, or different input formats, and that will help you in getting out better responses out of the overall interfaces. So with that, we have covered the first framework of the framework which we call ACE, which is analyze, craft, and evaluate for prompt engineering.